So from the start, and a d4, pawn takes, queen takes, knight f6, e5, knight c6, and queen a4, knight d5 is met by queen b3. And so we're looking at pawn to e6 defending the knight. So now, as we know, we have to play c4. And let's explore something different. Where f4 and f6 have no access for black. Knight e7 is not really ideal, but one can argue that the idea is to eventually play knight f5. If the bishop g7 and knight f5 looks like black could have some counterplay. So white continues with knight c3, normal developing move, and after bishop to g7, white now has to continue with bishop f4 to protect the pawn in e5 because it was going to be attacked twice. So after black castles, white can castle alongside. Good to put the rook on the same file of the opponent queen, and also offer more protection with square d5, which might eventually be pushed in order for this bishop to be released. Besides, this is now also reinforcing the square d6. So what happens after the natural f6? This move here is targeting the square e5. Black wants to take control of the central files with pawns, allow the rook to go on an open file, and also to be able to push the pawn of the d file without getting on the way of the e5 white pawn. We have to take. And now black can take in two different ways. After black takes with the bishop, for example, then bishop h6 attacking the rook. This could be met with rook going to f6 or to e8. Let's look at every way. There's also bishop g7. Let's look at all of them to understand how to exploit this type of pattern. Bishop g7, we take, king takes, and obviously now the dark squares around this king are a bit weaker, and our goal now is to play h4. And the goal here obviously is to involve the rook, and yeah, white has a good advantage, pretty solid advantage, and this is how you exploit this type of positions. Obviously h4, h5 is a typical idea. The best move by the engine is h5, stopping the disaster and all the swaps on the king side that were going to happen anyway. White now responds with knight to e4, and the idea obviously is to play queen to c3 with a deadly attack. The knight's attacking f6, f6, it's crucial. What happens after? We're just going to look at this move. It's a dead position, but still. What happens after d5? The idea obviously is that d5 can reach d4 after the check of the queen, so we can't really play queen to c3. Also because when we use the knight to take, for example, since black has two defenders, we also have two defenders, but then we allow the infiltration of the dark rook. And so the best move by white now is king to b1, simply prophylactic move. Black is in some sort of zugzwang. It looks like there's a lot of possible moves that black can play, but that will just involve black player going back and forth and not actually trying to progress. White setup will continue simply with bishop going to d3 after the knight has gone to g5, the knight in e goes to g5, and apply more and more pressure of the square e6, which is the backward pawn, with the rook going to e1. Also because this rook here has to give up on the idea of going to h5 on the h file. This is also because black has played only the best moves, and yet the advantage remains. The pawn cannot take the knight because of the rook taking the queen. The pawn in e cannot really be pushed, allowing freedom to this bishop because the pawn in d5 will run out of one of the main, most important defenders. The idea here we were going to explore is something like d4. In such a situation, it looks like the black player has been able to build to create a passed pawn, but now white continues with simply a3, preventing future moves like knight to b4. And the idea is to play eventually moves like knight f to g5 and then g4 in order to smash stuff around the opponent king side. So what happens after this move, right? We're just looking at this other idea before moving to the next line. It seems like black has created this nice central pawns, and one of them is passed pawn, but white now continues with bishop to d3. Now there's nothing to worry about a move like bishop g4, pinning the knight to the rook, simply because black has this kind of structure where this pawn in g6 is backwards, so the knight will be defending the knight properly, and eventually the rook can get out of the pin. A move like knight to f5 instead is met by the knight going to g5, knight f going to g5, and the idea now of playing g4, which is just a tremendous attack, since the knight will be preventing the bishop from being one of the defenders of such square. In this type of scenario, sometimes in case the knight doesn't go to f5, that is just an example to prove how this weakness is punished. You can also play a move like f3 and then g4. This is perfectly fine. Even giving up a pawn, that will do, since the rook will be able to reach the file of the king, and then h5 becomes possible. Back from the start, after queen takes d4, knight f6, e5, knight c6 is met by queen a4, knight d5, and then queen b3 attacking the knight, e6, and white continues with c4. What happens after a move like knight c7? White starts his attack on the dark squares, so bishop g5. This cannot be met by f6, obviously. So after either knight to e7 or bishop to e7. Knight to e7 kind of smothering the game. Although you might understand, you might argue that the reason it could be that black player doesn't want to give up the idea of fianchettoing this bishop. The problem with knight f7 as well is bishop f7, stopping the fianchetto from happening. And after bishop f6 attacking the rook, rook to g8, so in order not to lose the rook, is met by knight to g5, knight to g5. We have a pawn in e5, which is amazing. And obviously we have ideas like knight e4, the knight's attacking the d6 square. That will force black to play a move like bishop to g7 in order to give space for the king, but then we can trade the bishops or even stay, depending on what other moves black will do. Best move by black according to the engine is h6. So we can play knight e4. So best move now is bishop to g7. d6 was not possible because you have double attack on d6. So after bishop to g7, white now continues with queen a3. So you can see how in so many different lines the patterns are very similar. Once a certain type of position has been reached, then things remain pretty much the same. So you can recognize such patterns whenever they arise. So what can black do? Well, he can't really, he doesn't have access to d5. The knight is pinned in e7, so d6 doesn't work. And black might think of taking the bishop in order to start releasing a little bit of pressure, although we will have a very strong pawn in f6. Again, this knight can't move, so this bishop is a monster. So let's have a look at this line to understand this pattern. Bishop takes, knight now goes to d6 with the check, king moves, and we finally recaptures the bishop, but we have placed this knight in d6. And now we have a threat of a discover attack. So that's deadly. If black were to move this knight to c6, then knight b7 will win the queen. So in this position, taking the bishop is deadly. King f8 is the best move according to the engine. Black will have to try and remove the queen from the pin. And now white very quietly goes on with knight to c3. And white now has an advantage as well. +6 to +7. The position is terrible for black. He can't really move anything without losing material. One more line. So one more line after c4 and the knight goes to c7 and we attack the queen. We notice the problems that will appear after knight to e7. So the black player will have to give up on the idea of fianchettoing this bishop, even though that was the initial plan. After bishop to e7, white continues with h4. And the idea obviously is to open the file for the rook. So if the bishop were to take our bishop, we will take with the pawn, applying pressure on these squares. And that's a big problem because black played the Sicilian defense. Moving the c pawn will make the black player not very safe castling the other side, the queen side. Also, it's going to take a while before black gets to develop these pieces because of the pawn, and white's position is so much better after white actually can castle alongside, because white's got initiative, so it's got less to worry about unsafe king. Yeah, of course, that doesn't mean that we should not worry enough about unsafe king, but we know that the black player is trying to castle kingside. White's development is too fluid after knight c3 and the rook to d1. So, and also we have a pawn in e5, which is a great pawn, stopping the arrival of the other pawn, this d6 pawn, for example. And with the rook, we will be controlling the file forever. So that means that the black player should not take this bishop, because that just helps white's attack. What happens after a normal move like h6, attacking the bishop? Then we can take the opponent bishop. And now it looks like maybe things could go fine after queen to e7. Why did we give up the bishop? Well, it's like giving away the bishop for the fianchettoed bishop. We give away the bishop that is controlling the weak squares. Which squares are weak near the opponent king? The dark squares, because they're not protected by pawns, by black's pawns. So if we remove the bishop, then we remove the dark square bishop. We are removing the bishop that is attacking such squares. So after taking and taking back, White continues with queen e3. The idea is simply to play knight c3 and rook to d1, controlling this file forever. Queen e3 is also an amazing move, also because it's keeping an eye on the square h6, which means the black can't castle without going through queen h6 as just a devastating attack. The pawn is going as well, and yeah, so there's no reason for the black king to be in g8 when the white queen is in h6. So what happens after d6 here looks like a normal move, in a way that it's allowing the bishop from making this move and the king from castling, and maybe black will be able to play a normal game. And also black wants to maybe challenge the control that the e5 pawn is keeping. Well, we take the pawn, queen has to take back, and we go on with development. Knight c3. The good thing about taking the pawn in d6, yes, you might argue that black has made a move that will allow him to develop very soon, but at the same time, that by taking the pawn in d6, we force the black queen to be in the d file, and we can eventually attack it with rook d1 and win a lot of tempos. So what happens after bishop to d7? White's best move is bishop to e2. That's the most accurate. So if now black castles longside, white can continue to castle and carry on with the game. Here, black should probably play a move like king b8. Also because white has this usual plan, if king stays in c8 and black plays something else, either like pushing a pawn or whatever, white has a plan for knight b5, and after the queen moves away, let's say queen e7, the knight will have double attack in a7, so the king will have to go to b8 anyway. The knight and the queen will have a double attack in a7, and we can take a pawn for free. So after king to b8, and the rook in a is finally going to d1, and kicking the queen away, we must not forget that we have a majority of pawns on the queen side, and we can work out how to push them and go for an attack on the black king. The black queen will have to retreat. What happens after queen to b4 going for this pawn? Then that's not going to work after knight to b5. We have a pawn and the bishop supporting b5, and this pawn in b2 happens to be poisoned. So after queen takes and rook to b1, we will have an attack on b7 and the knight ready to go to d6. The queen doesn't have any access over the dark squares, they're all protected by the knights. After queen takes and knight d6, position is looking fantastic for white. Needless to say, after b6, rook attacks the queen again. The queen is now forced to go away. Queen b2 is met by rook going to b1 and future sacrifice in b6, whereas the queen going somewhere else like c2 is still met by the same idea. So in the previous position after rook d1, the queen b4 was wrong. It just allows us to win tempos, and the pawn is poisoned. Even if queen doesn't take the pawn, we're still winning tempos after a 3 b4. So after queen goes to e7, for example, white now continues with the plan a3, and the idea of pushing the pawns on the majority. Black has a problem of moving the c7 knight anywhere, and white is up the initiative basically after b4. Last thing I want to mention for this line is that a move like e5, which seems to be giving more freedom to the bishop, maybe in future support a move like f5, and allows the knight to move away and maybe reach other squares in the future, is met immediately by knight d5 attacking the queen and winning tempos again. If knight were to take the knight, then we can take back with the pawn. We're giving up the majority against the minority because now we have 2 against 2, but we have a passed pawn, and this knight is going to be misplaced. And white's advantage is beyond 2 pieces because of absolute comfort in the endgame, not to mention the free pawn. So the knight can't really be taken without a disaster happening. So the queen moving will lose a tempo. So after knight d5 and queen f8, for example, then we will still be able to take the pawn in e8, threatening to take this with a check, so we don't have to worry about rook e8. The queen instead moves to e8, putting more defense over the square e5. Then we simply swap knight, king takes back, and then we carry on with the attack of the majority. So 3 against 2.